The Galactic Council called humans animals, then faced the hunt. The chamber was already laughing when I walked in. I did not know that at first. The sound reached me before my brain could name it, a high, layered frequency rolling through the convocation hall like a wave through deep water. 214 species, each producing their own version of amusement, and my translator earpiece was working very hard to convert all of it into something a human mind could process. It settled, after a fraction of a second, on the closest available equivalent. Laughter. They were laughing before the vote was even announced. My name is Ilara Voss. I had spent 11 years preparing for this moment. 11 years of language courses, cultural briefings, xenosociology seminars, deep space transit, and diplomatic protocol training across 4 galactic frameworks just to stand at this podium. In this hall, on this station orbiting a star that human cartographers had simply labeled Kepler 9, because nothing more poetic had stuck yet. I was Earth's first official delegate candidate to the Galactic Council. I was 38 years old. I had given everything I had to this single moment. The vote came back 211 to 3. Denied. The Vethsari delegate rose from the central chair. Her species was tall and naturally luminescent. Their skin produced a soft blue-green light that pulsed very faintly when they breathed, like something deep underwater. Her name, as best as my translator could render it in any human language, was Vale Sur. She had chaired the Galactic Council for 60 years. She had watched species rise and collapse. She had, by all accounts, never raised her voice in this chamber in all that time. She did not raise it now. She did not need to. She read from the formal declaration in the common galactic tongue, and my earpiece converted her words into English one careful phrase at a time. The species known as Homo sapiens, originating from the 3rd orbital body of the Sol system, has been assessed by the full Council and found to be incompatible with membership in the galactic community. The assessment is grounded in the following documented characteristics: a recorded history of organized conflict spanning every era of their existence, a neurological architecture built primarily around predatory impulse and territorial response, a cultural framework that consistently glorifies competition, conquest, and the subjugation of weaker organisms, biological drives that routinely override rational consensus behavior in high-pressure environments. On the basis of these findings, the Council concludes that admission of this species poses an unacceptable risk to the stability of galactic civilization. She paused. The hall had gone very quiet. Even the ambient hum of the life support system seemed, in that moment, to pull back. The species is hereby classified as Tier 0, predatory classification, non-member status, quarantine protocol recommended, pending further behavioral study. I had heard all the words before. I had read the preliminary assessments. I had prepared responses, counterarguments, diplomatic frameworks designed to address every objection the Council might raise. I had a speech ready 17 pages, practiced 200 times in the mirror, translated into 4 galactic languages by Nina Cross herself, who was the best xenolinguist on Earth's staff. I said none of it, because Vale Sur then added one line that had not appeared in any preliminary report, one line that was clearly not part of the official declaration, spoken very quietly, almost as an aside to the chamber rather than to me. Her voice was not cruel. It was the tone of someone stating an obvious fact about an animal they had been asked to evaluate. My translator caught it without hesitation. They are in the end simply animals. The laughter returned, softer this time, almost gentle, the way you might smile at a dog that tried to climb onto the furniture. I stood at that podium for exactly 4 seconds after the translation landed in my ear. 4 seconds in which every prepared response, every diplomatic framework, every carefully worded counterargument dissolved and was replaced by something much simpler, something cold and clear and very steady. Certainty. I pressed the speaker button. The hall quieted completely. "Delegate Vale, sir," I said, and my voice was perfectly level. "I want to thank the council for this assessment. I want to thank you for being thorough and honest and clear. I have one thing to say before my delegation departs." Vale, sir, inclined her head slightly, the formal gesture of permission granted. "You have no idea what you just did." No dramatic pause, no gesture, no raised voice. I stepped back from the podium, gathered my materials, and walked out of the convocation hall with the remaining 2 members of Earth's delegation, Lieutenant Commander Pete Garland and Cultural Attaché Nina Cross, 1 step behind me on each side. The door sealed behind us with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The corridor outside was long and lit in the cold white spectrum that the Vethsari preferred. Our footsteps made very little sound on the composite floor. Pete Garland was 6'4", former Navy, built like someone who had spent 30 years being useful in difficult situations, and possessed of an emotional range that most people compared to a particularly weathered cliff face. He said nothing for a full 60 seconds as we walked. Then he said, "That went well." Nina Cross, who held a doctorate in xenolinguistics, had negotiated a trade dispute between 2 separate insect-based civilizations without using spoken language at any point, and had not slept more than 5 hours the night before, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I said nothing. I was already thinking about what came next. The escort arrived before we reached the docking bay. 4 Vethsari enforcement officers in formal gray uniforms, polite and completely immovable. They walked us to our ship. They waited outside until we were aboard. Then they confirmed, through the external comm system, that our departure clearance had been issued and that our return vector to the Sol system had been preloaded into the navigation relay. They also confirmed that, effective immediately, all human vessels were subject to a new quarantine enforcement protocol. Any human ship found operating outside the Sol system boundary would be flagged, intercepted, and impounded. Any crew member who resisted the impoundment process would be, in the official translation, contained. Pete read the bulletin on the display screen and looked at me. "Contained," he said. "Yes," I said. Interesting word choice. They chose it very carefully. The ship undocked and Kepler station shrank behind us in the rear display, a brilliant, complicated structure of light and metal roughly 10 kilometers long, home to the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. I watched it until it became a point of light among the other points of light. Then I turned away from the window and pulled up the secure communication channel to Earth Command. There were 47 human vessels currently deployed in deep space, deployed weeks ago before the vote, positioned in regions well past what was now being called the quarantine line. Earth Command knew about all of them. I knew about most of them. We had not told the Council about any of them. I sent a single encoded message, "Vote result as expected, no change in operations, continue." The reply came back in under 3 minutes. "Confirmed, continue." I closed the channel and sat back in my chair. The stars outside the viewport were the same stars they had always been, ancient, indifferent, scattered across the dark in patterns that human beings had been drawing lines between since before we had words. We had finally reached one of those stars. We had stood in the hall where the civilization of that star was governed, and we had been told to go home. Pete appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, ship coffee, which was always terrible. He handed me one without comment and leaned against the frame. "Do you think they know," he asked after a moment, "about the other ships?" "No," I said. "They think we're like them. They think a formal declaration closes a conversation." "It doesn't." "No, it opens a different one." Nina appeared behind him, tablet already in hand, already working. She was the kind of person who metabolized stress through action, which made her extraordinary to have around in a situation like this. I have been running translations on the secondary audio from the chamber, she said. The laughter was not uniform across the hall. 4 delegations did not participate. The Drell stayed completely silent throughout. So did the Korath. 2 others I have not positively identified yet. But I have narrowed it down. That was interesting. The Drell and the Korath were both long-standing council members. Respected, stable, known for following the consensus position of the Vethsari on most governance questions. Log it, I said. Already done. I drank my coffee. It was terrible, but it was hot and real, and it tasted, faintly, like earth. I thought about the word Veilsur had used. I turned it over slowly in my mind the way you turn a stone to see what lives on the underside. She was not entirely wrong. Humans were predators. We had evolved from hunters. Our eyes faced forward, depth perception, motion tracking, the geometry of pursuit. Our brains were wired for pattern recognition, threat assessment, the rapid calculation of risk and reward in situations where the cost of error was survival. We had spent 10,000 years building civilization on top of those instincts, layering language and law and philosophy over the top of something older, but we had never quite removed it. The council had looked at that deep structure and called it a flaw. I thought, sitting in the quiet of the ship as Kepler station disappeared behind us, that they had made a serious miscalculation. Not because we were dangerous, though we could be. Not because we were violent, though we had been. But because there is something a predator learns, over 10,000 years of hunting and being hunted and adapting to both, that a civilization built entirely on consensus and comfort never quite develops. A predator never stops looking. And we had a great deal of space to look through. 3 weeks later, the first of 47 ships crossed the quarantine line. None of them had received orders to come home. Pete Garland had a saying he had picked up from his grandmother, who had grown up in a fishing town on the Cornish coast. The ocean does not care about your rules. He said it quietly to himself, standing at the forward viewport of the Persistence on the morning we crossed the quarantine line, a coffee cup in one hand, a navigation display in the other. I heard him because I was standing 3 feet away, and the bridge was very still at that hour, the kind of still that only happens at 4 in the morning on a deep space vessel when most of the crew is asleep, and the stars outside the windows are the only audience. Commander Devon Rao, who ran the Persistence with the particular calm that made junior crew members either deeply reassured or faintly unsettled, depending on their constitution, looked up from his console. "Your grandmother sounds like a sensible woman, Lieutenant Commander." "She really was," Pete said. I was not supposed to be on this ship. After the convocation, Earth Command had offered me a desk position, a comfortable assignment at the Diplomatic Coordination Office in Geneva, where I could file reports, prepare briefings, and wait for whatever came next. It was safe. It was reasonable. It was very far from anything useful. I had declined in the same message in which I requested reassignment as liaison officer to the Persistence, which was already 3 weeks past the quarantine line and moving steadily deeper into restricted space. Earth Command had approved my request without adding any commentary to the authorization. That told me something about how they were thinking. The Persistence was a long-range exploration vessel. Not military, not commercial, something in the category that humanity had been building for 100 years without settling on a proper name for it. Fast and quiet, with the best passive sensor array that Earth could currently produce, crewed by 41 people who had all specifically requested deep space assignment in the months before the council vote. Rao had selected every single one of them personally, which was unusual. Commanders of his rank typically worked with whatever crew logistics assigned them. The fact that he had hand-picked this particular group told you something about what he expected the assignment to involve. The mission was officially cartographic. We were mapping the region the Vethsari called the Protected Expanse, a 30 light-year buffer zone designated as sovereign territory, though our research had found no council vessel logged in the area for decades. According to every available data source, it was empty space. No habitable planets, no significant asteroid resources, no strategic position that our analysts could identify from the outside. That was the first thing that bothered me. Why would the Vethsari protect empty space? Their borders were precise and maintained. They did not declare sovereignty over regions casually. Every piece of Vethsari territory had a documented purpose, and yet here was a 30 light-year zone of apparently nothing, ringed by enforcement beacons, listed as restricted in every galactic navigation database, with no explanation offered in any public record. Rao had a theory. He kept it to himself for the first 2 weeks aboard. On day 15, past the quarantine line, he called me to his office, a small room behind the bridge that smelled like engine lubricant and physical maps that no one used anymore, and laid it out plainly. "Something happened out here," he said. "Something they do not want anyone to find. A cover-up. I think they built a fence around something. And in my experience, when someone builds a fence around something and tells you there is nothing inside, nothing is not what you find." He was right. We found the first wreck on day 19. It appeared on the long-range scanner as a mass anomaly, something large and metallic drifting in a slow orbit around a brown dwarf that had no logical reason to have anything in orbit around it. Our sensor operator, a young woman named Grace Fuller, flagged it at 4 in the morning, and by 6 Rao had the persistence positioned 300 kilometers off its port side. It was a freighter. Galactic Council registration markings on the hull, species unknown to us at first glance, but Nina Cross identified it within 4 minutes as a Drell transport vessel. The Drell were an amphibious Council member species, widely respected, known throughout the galaxy primarily as traders and long-range explorers. They were not a species that lost ships without anyone noticing. Our engineers spent 2 hours on remote sensor analysis before they reached their conclusion. The ship had been destroyed from the inside. The hull breaches were outward-facing. Whatever had caused the damage had originated within the vessel itself. There was no crew. There was no cargo. There was, in the lower compartment of the ship, in a stasis pod that had somehow survived whatever had happened to everything around it, one survivor. Getting him out took 6 hours. The pod was old and damaged, responding to commands in a Drell communication protocol that Nina had to reconstruct almost from scratch using 3 reference databases, and a patience that I found genuinely extraordinary to watch. When the pod finally opened, the being inside was amphibious, smooth-skinned, with wide, flat eyes that had clouded over during the long sleep. His skin had the gray-green color of something that had not seen light in a very long time. Our ship's medic was Oliver Crane, a quiet and methodical man who approached medicine the way he approached everything, carefully, without drama, and with a deep reluctance to accept failure as an outcome. He worked on the survivor for 2 hours, cross-referencing everything against the xenobiology files in the ship's database, making adjustments, rechecking. We did not know with certainty that Drell physiology was compatible with our equipment. Oliver proceeded on the assumption that it was, because the alternative was not something he was willing to consider. At the 3rd hour, the Drell opened his eyes. Nina was there with the translator ready. She introduced herself. She explained where he was. She explained that he was aboard a human vessel, that he was safe, that we had found him in the wreck. She spoke slowly, giving the translator time to process. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and grabbed her arm with surprising strength and said one word before his eyes closed again. The translator rendered it as Reapers. Rao called a senior staff meeting in the briefing room that lasted 20 minutes. By the end of it, 3 decisions had been made. We were continuing the survey. All data would be encrypted and transmitted to Earth on a time delay burst signal, and nothing from this point forward would be discussed on any channel that might be monitored externally. Over the next 6 days, we found 4 more wrecks. Then 9 more. 17 ships total, scattered across 40 million kilometers of the expanse. Different species, different eras of construction. Different council registration codes, but all of them were council vessels. All had been destroyed by internal damage, and all were drifting in the kinds of slow orbits that suggested they had been there for years, some for decades. Grace Fuller had said very little since the first find. She was the kind of person who processed things internally before she spoke. On the day we confirmed Rec 17, she sat very still at her scanner station for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "Someone has been cleaning up out here." No one answered her. There was no better explanation available. The Drell survivor, Oliver, had confirmed his name was Sevketh through careful, slow conversations that Nina conducted over 3 days, had been a cargo officer on the transport. His ship had entered the expanse 11 years ago following a distress signal, a council emergency frequency, the kind you are required to respond to, because that is the foundation on which the entire network of galactic cooperation rests. They had found nothing. On the return journey, something had attacked them. Sevketh described it in fragments, pulling the memories up slowly, his eyes focused on something that was not in the room. It was not a ship. It was not any creature. It was precise and fast and completely silent. It had moved through the ship the way a current moves through water, not stopping, not hesitating, following paths that a living thing would not follow. He had survived because he had been in the lower cargo hold when it began. He had sealed himself in and activated emergency stasis before whatever it was reached him. He did not know if any of his crew had lived. Based on the state of the wreck, Oliver's quiet and careful assessment was, no. Rao studied all of it for a full day before he said what I had been thinking. "These are not accidents," he said. "Whatever is out here, it is deliberate, it is systematic, and the Council knows it exists." On day 31, 3 Vethsari enforcement cruisers appeared on long-range scanner, approaching at standard intercept speed. Their comm opened 2 minutes later. The message was polite, formal, and completely clear. Stand down, prepare for boarding, failure to comply would result in containment. Rao looked at me across the bridge. I looked at him. 41 people, 17 wrecks, a Drell survivor asleep in the medical bay, encrypted data burning toward Earth on a tight beam signal that had been transmitting for 6 days. "Commander," I said, "I believe we have somewhere to be." Rao turned to the helm without any change in expression. "Full speed, non-standard vector, let us see what they do." The Persistence ran. And 3 Vethsari enforcement cruisers, which had spent their entire operational history dealing with species that complied when given a direct order, gave chase. They had made an assumption. It was the same assumption the Council had been making about us for years. They were wrong about it then. They were wrong about it now. And the next 3 weeks were going to teach them something that no assessment report had ever managed to capture. The thing about predators is that they do not run in straight lines. The Persistence had a top speed that was, on paper, slightly inferior to a Vethsari enforcement cruiser. Rao had read those specifications carefully. He had also spent 3 decades flying ships through places where specifications were suggestions and official ratings were starting points for negotiation, and he had learned something that the tactical manuals did not cover in any meaningful depth. The number on the specification sheet tells you how fast a ship goes when the pilot is following procedure. Procedure was something Rao treated as a reference document rather than a rule book. On the first day of the pursuit, he took the Persistence through a debris field that every Vethsari scanner in the region had flagged as impassable. It was not impassable. It was dense and complicated. A belt of shattered rock and frozen gas left over from a planetary collision a few million years ago. The kind of environment where your scanner shows you 10 obstacles, and there are 30 more between them that the scan missed. Navigating it required constant manual course correction, the ability to read debris drift patterns in real time, and a particular kind of nerve that is not taught in any academy because it cannot be taught that way. You either have it or you spend your career in clear space. Rao had it. Our navigator, Lieutenant Carol Banks, had it. Between the two of them, they took the Persistence through the debris field in 4 hours. The lead Vethsari cruiser entered behind us and lost engine power when a fragment struck its forward intake at the specific angle where its shield geometry had a documented gap. It was not destroyed. It simply stopped, drifting, while its crew worked on the repair. The other 2 cruisers pulled back to the field's edge and held position, sweeping their scanners across the debris looking for us. We were already through the other side. 2 remaining, Grace reported from the scanner station. Positions, Rao asked. Field edge, stationary, they are waiting. For us to come out. Yes, sir. Rao was quiet for a moment, looking at the display. Then he asked, how close is that brown dwarf to our current position? Carol Banks pulled up the calculation without waiting to be asked specifically. She had the answer in 40 seconds. 3 light towers. If we move immediately and use the gravitational pull correctly, we can slingshot around it and emerge on the far side of the debris field. Will they anticipate that? Carol considered it. Their navigation protocols are optimized for clear space. The computation required to plan a gravity-assist maneuver around a stellar body, while under active pursuit, is not a standard tactical calculation in any Council enforcement database. She paused. I know this because I requested the database from the Council's public navigation library 6 weeks ago and read through it. Rao looked at her. You read the Vethsari navigation database. I read everything available, sir. I find it useful. The slingshot took 8 hours. 8 hours of flying toward a brown dwarf, swinging around in a long arc calculated to 3 decimal places by Carol Banks, and coming out on the far side of the field, directly behind the 2 cruisers that had been waiting for us to emerge from the front. They picked us up on scanner about 90 seconds after we appeared. By that point, we had already matched their speed, and were alongside them at 300 kilometers separation, before either vessel had processed what was happening to them. Rao opened the comm channel himself. This is Commander Devon Rao of the Persistence. We are returning to the wreck survey site. We need to complete our documentation. We would prefer that you did not follow us this time, though I understand if you feel you must. He closed the channel and looked at Pete Garland. Pete said, that might have been slightly provocative. It might have been, Rao agreed pleasantly. Helm, take us back to the wreck field. We went back because we were not finished. This was the thing the Vethsari strategists had not anticipated. The entire structure of containment is built on one assumption, that the contained party wants to leave. That movement is the goal. That freedom of travel is what is being sought. And once you apply sufficient pressure, the contained party's desire for safety will override their desire for motion. Humans do not work that way. We went back because the data was incomplete, and incomplete data was not something Rao was willing to deliver to Earth. We went back because Sevketh was awake now and had more to tell us. We went back because 17 wrecked ships and a weapon we had not yet understood were not things you left behind and called the mission finished. The Vethsari cruisers followed at a distance. They tracked our position. They did not move to intercept again, which told me that they had received new instructions from somewhere above their operational authority. They were waiting for something. Reinforcements, most likely. Grace Fuller had been working on the wreck data without adequate sleep for 6 consecutive days when she found the pattern. Oliver Crane had asked her 3 times to rest. She had acknowledged each request and continued working. On day 7, she sat back from her console and said, every ship was destroyed by the same mechanism. It was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It was a signal, a targeted pulse of electromagnetic energy, precise in frequency and duration, designed to interact specifically with the power core architecture that all Galactic Council vessels used as a common technical standard. The pulse caused a feedback loop in the core cycling system. The feedback loop caused catastrophic failure that originated from within the vessel itself, producing outward hull breaches. It was elegant. It was silent. It left no physical trace except the damage it caused, which looked, on any post-incident analysis, like an internal malfunction rather than an external attack. It was also, after Nina Cross and Grace Fuller, and 3 of our engineers spent 40 hours cross-referencing it against every known technology database on the ship, definitively not the technology of any species currently recognized by the Galactic Council. It was engineered, purpose-built. It required active maintenance to remain operational, and it was still running in the expanse, which was why the area had been declared protected, why enforcement cruisers patrolled the border, and why every ship that had stumbled inside had been destroyed before it could transmit what it had found. The Council had not built a fence around empty space. They had built a fence around a weapon, their weapon, a weapon that destroyed their own member species when those species followed their own emergency signals into a zone their own government controlled. I called the senior staff meeting and laid it out. I did not speculate beyond the data. The data did not require speculation. Rouse sat with his hands folded on the briefing table for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "The quarantine is not to protect the galaxy from humanity. No, it is to protect this program from humanity, specifically from the kind of species that goes into a place they have been told is empty and asks why it is not empty. That is the most consistent interpretation of everything we have found." Grace said, "The signal relay stations, the ones that power the weapon, they are on a maintenance cycle, regular intervals, someone services them." "That means there is a schedule," Carol said. "A schedule means records." Rao nodded once, then he looked at me. "Transmit everything we have to Earth, full dataset now, not on the delay." We transmitted. 6 hours later, the confirmation came back from Earth Command. They had received it. They had verified it. They were not waiting any longer. On the scanner, Grace sat up sharply. "New contacts, bearing 173 Mark 40, multiple." "How many?" Rao asked. She counted, recounted, looked up from the display. 206, sir. Human ships, all of them, crossing the quarantine line in a coordinated formation that spanned 40,000 kilometers of space, broadcasting on every open frequency in the common galactic tongue. The message was short. "You called us animals, now we hunt." The 2 Veth-Sari cruisers that had been tracking us at a distance went completely still on our scanner. They did not move. They did not respond on any channel. They watched. I stood at the scanner station beside Grace and looked at 206 contact points, moving in formation through space that the Galactic Council had told us was forbidden. Pete Garland appeared at my shoulder and looked at the same display. He said. It was, for Pete, a significant emotional statement. Carol Banks ran the numbers without being asked. At their current speed and bearing, they reached the outer wreck boundary in approximately 19 hours. The enforcement cruisers cannot intercept more than a fraction of that formation with their current deployment. "How many enforcement vessels does the Council have in this sector?" Rao asked. 11, Grace said. "All converging now. But 206 to 11 is not a ratio that favors containment. Not when the 206 have already reviewed our data and know exactly what they are flying into." Rao stood at the front of the bridge for a long moment looking at the display. The formation held its shape cleanly, coordinated, steady, moving with a precision that a collection of civilian and semi-military vessels had no theoretical reason to manage. But they were human vessels, and the crews had been talking to each other for weeks over the encrypted fleet channel, sharing everything we had transmitted, preparing together for something they had not been formally ordered to do. They had chosen to come. That was the thing the containment model could never account for. You cannot contain a decision. You can block a ship, intercept a vessel, impound a crew, but you cannot reach inside a human being and remove the specific impulse that makes them look at a fence and ask what it is actually protecting. 9 hours later, the first Vethsari enforcement vessel attempted an intercept on the lead human ship and was given a single calm choice: stand aside or be documented standing aside. The enforcement vessel stood aside. By hour 14, all 11 Council enforcement vessels in the sector had made the same calculation. They fell into a loose orbit at the edge of the formation and watched. They filed reports. They documented everything. We wanted that. We wanted their own officers to be the witnesses. When the formation reached the wreck field and the relay stations powered up in response, the entire sequence played out exactly as the briefing had described. The pulse attempts, the adaptive bypass, the signal turned back on itself, the shutdown. And then 3 of the enforcement vessel commanders, after watching all of it, opened their own channels and asked permission to approach. A former cargo pilot named Leon Price, commanding the Calvert, opened the return channel and said simply, "Come ahead." Grace Fuller looked at her scanner readout, and for the first time since we had found the first wreck, she smiled. It was brief and tired, but it was real. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "we go back to Kepler Station, and we sit down at a table." The convocation hall looked different when you were not standing at the delegate rail. I had not expected that. I had spent years imagining this chamber, in my preparation, in my sleep, in the long nights of work that had led to that first vote, and I thought I knew its proportions completely. But the table changes the geometry of a room. From the circular delegate table, which was large enough to seat representatives of 214 species comfortably, the ceiling was higher. The observation galleries that ringed the upper level in a continuous band of light were farther away. The chair at the center of the circular arrangement, currently occupied by Rel Kavash of the Drell, who had been elected to the rotating chairmanship 6 weeks ago in the first contested council election in 30 years, was level with every other chair at the table. No one here was technically above anyone else. I had walked into the station without an escort this time. The guards at the entrance had looked at my credentials. They had looked at the displays showing what was currently happening in the expanse. They had made a quiet, practical decision and let me through. That told me something about how quickly everything was shifting. The emergency session had been called by a joint motion from 11 species. The standard requirement was 3. The Drell had moved it. The Koreth had seconded. 9 others had added their names within an hour of the data broadcast going out on open frequencies. 11 species calling an emergency session simultaneously was, as Nina had confirmed from the procedural records she had reviewed the previous night, something that had not happened in the history of the current council structure. Vailsur had called for the session as well, moving to chair it under the emergency powers of the council leadership position. That had been blocked by the joint motion, which superseded individual leadership authority in cases of formal multi-species inquiry. She was sitting at the table now in the Vethsari seat, without a visible change in her expression. She was still fighting. I respected that even as I worked against it. I was in the observer section nearest to the floor, technically present as a guest of the Drell delegation, because Earth had not yet been formally admitted and I had no official standing at the table. This was a temporary situation, but I was in the room, I could see everything, and for now that was sufficient. The session opened. Vailsur moved immediately to define the agenda, the unauthorized human incursion into protected space, the legal framework for enforcement action, the restoration of the quarantine protocol. Her motion was crisp and procedurally sound. Relkavash requested recognition before it could be seconded. Vailsur granted it. She probably expected a formal countermotion, something she could root through the standard amendment process and delay for days. Relkavash said, "I would like the registration codes from the 17 vessels displayed on the chamber screen before we discuss anything else." The room was very quiet. Vailsur said, "This session has been convened to address the matter of the unauthorized incursion." The registration codes, Delegate Vailsur. The pause that followed was exactly long enough to carry meaning. Then the codes appeared on the chamber screen. Whoever in the technical operations staff had placed them, there had done so without waiting for the chair's authorization. It was a small act. It was also the first visible fracture in the structure that had held this council together for decades. Relkavash read the codes. He sat down very slowly and did not speak again for several minutes. 3 of the 17 destroyed ships carried Drell registry numbers. The Koreth delegate did not wait for formal recognition. He stood and said, in a voice that was entirely flat in the specific way of someone who has moved past any emotion that has a name, 4 of the vessels shown are Koreth registry. I want to know why the Council has no record of their loss. 2 long-standing member species, both formally requesting answers simultaneously, broke Vailsur's ability to redirect the session through procedure. She tried 3 separate mechanisms over the following 40 minutes. Each one failed. Votes that had reliably gone the Vethsari direction for decades shifted without warning. Species that had not moved against Council leadership in living memory either abstained or voted no. Not because they had suddenly become sympathetic to humanity, but because the data was in the room with them, clearly visible, and the data was saying things that could not be procedurally redirected. Meanwhile, in the expanse itself, the human fleet was doing something that Vethsari strategic planning had apparently not modeled. It was not fighting. Rao's general orders distributed before I left the Persistence to return to Kepler Station were plain: survey, document, and broadcast everything. Do not engage the weapon system unless survival requires it. Do not attack Council vessels. Do not destroy the relay stations, study them. Let the enforcement cruisers observe if they want to observe. 206 ships moved through the expanse with the systematic patience of a species that had spent 10,000 years mapping territory that other things would rather it stayed away from. They logged every relay station. They mapped the complete signal architecture of the weapon system. They documented the maintenance cycle patterns. The stations were serviced on a regular schedule, which meant a maintenance team, which meant a chain of authorization, which meant a record that went somewhere specific. The fleet's intelligence team, working from the flagship S. Calvert, began extracting data directly from the relay station's own internal logs. It took 12 hours to access them. It took another 8 hours to break the encryption, which the team accomplished by treating it as a pattern problem rather than a direct decryption attempt, a distinction that turned out to matter greatly. What they found was a document trail going back 400 years. The weapon system had been commissioned by a 7-member Vethsari Council subcommittee. It had been approved under a classification level that did not appear in any publicly accessible Council document. It had been maintained ever since by rotating teams of Vethsari technicians operating under standing orders that referenced no formal policy and reported to no public authority. The stated justification in the original commission document: prophylactic measure to prevent expansion of unstable biological entities into strategic corridor space. Unstable biological entities. They had built it before they knew we existed. They had built it to keep species they considered unsuitable from accessing a region of space they wanted to control. And when vessels from their own Council member species had followed their own emergency signals into that region, the weapon had performed exactly as designed, and the Council had said nothing. When Grace Fuller transmitted the commission document on the open broadcast frequency, the emergency session stopped being a political proceeding and became something else entirely. Something that had no formal name in council procedure, because nothing like it had happened before in the structure's recorded history. Vale Sir called for a recess. The motion failed, first time in 60 years. She sat very still in her seat. In the expanse, the weapon activated. The relay stations powered up. The pulse signal began cycling through its targeting sequence. This was the moment I had been briefed on but not witnessed, and every crew in the human fleet had been briefed on it too. No one scattered. Every ship had been given Grace Fuller's full technical analysis of the weapon mechanism before they crossed the quarantine line. Every chief engineer had pre-configured a manual bypass protocol for the power core cycling system based on the specific pulse frequency. Every crew had drilled it. They drilled the way humans have always prepared for threats, not to be comfortable, but to survive. The first pulse targeted 3 ships. 2 absorbed it without significant damage. The third lost power briefly and restored it on manual bypass in 40 seconds. The weapon tried again. The fleet adapted the bypass in real time, ship to ship across an open tactical channel. The updated procedure distributed and implemented across 200 vessels faster than any central command structure could have managed, because it was not moving through a command structure. It was moving through people talking to each other about a problem they had already decided to solve. The third pulse hit nothing meaningful. The weapon's algorithm required confirmation of a successful impact before proceeding to its next stage. No confirmed impact meant the system cycled back to the beginning. One ship, the S. Hartwell, a science vessel whose crew had apparently decided that passive documentation was insufficient, began transmitting the weapon's own signal back at the relay stations on a modified frequency. Not at full power, just enough to make the stations receive what appeared to be their own output coming from an unexpected direction. The stations had no protocol for that situation. They began cycling in conflict with each other, each one trying to resolve a contradiction that their programming had not been built to handle. The weapon shut down. The Hartwell's chief science officer sent a brief message on the fleet channel: "Relay network inactive. Someone may want to inform the council." Someone did. When the news reached the convocation hall, the chamber went very quiet. A different kind of quiet from the one I had experienced the day of the vote. That had been the quiet of agreement. This was the quiet of people who had run out of answers and were sitting with that fact. Vale Sir looked at me. I had not moved from my observer seat in 6 hours. I had not spoken. The data had done everything I would have said, in a language that every species in the room could read without any translation required. She crossed the floor to me, alone. No staff, no escort. Vale Sir, who had governed the Galactic Council for 60 years, walking across a chamber to speak privately to a human who was technically present only as a guest of another delegation. "What do you want?" she asked. I had thought about this question for months. I gave her the honest answer. "A seat at this table," I said, "and full disclosure of the Expanse program on the formal record, everything, to every species in this council." She was quiet for a moment with weight in it. "And if we refuse?" she asked finally. I looked at her steadily. "Then we continue what we have been doing. We go deeper, we find more. We broadcast what we find. We are very patient, and we do not stop looking." She held my gaze for a long time. Then she went back to her seat. The vote for formal inquiry into the Expanse program passed 209 to 5. Vale Sir voted in favor. She did not look at me when she pressed the confirmation, but she voted yes, and that told me something important about who she was underneath the decades of politics. Someone who, when the actual point of no return arrived, chose the harder, honest thing over the easier continuation of a lie. I sent a message to Rao on the persistence. "It is working," I said. His reply came 40 seconds later. "Of course it is. What comes next?" I sat back in my chair and looked at the circular table where, in 6 months, Earth would have a seat. "Everything," I said. 6 months later, the seat was real. I sat at the convocation table, not behind the rail, not in the observation gallery, not standing at a podium with permission to address the chamber. I sat at the table itself, in a chair that had been formally added to the arrangement to accommodate Earth's delegation, in the circular configuration of 215 species that now constituted the reformed Galactic Council. The number had gone up by 1. My title on the official record was Earth's Senior Delegate, a position that had not existed 8 months ago. Nina Cross sat to my left with her tablet open and 3 simultaneous translation feeds running. Pete Garland sat to my right because I had specifically requested him, and because Pete Garland at a diplomatic table was, in his own words, honestly a bit alarming in ways that no one can quite articulate, which was exactly what I had intended. The session was being broadcast on every major galactic network. The viewing audience was larger than any council session in the past 2 centuries. The chamber had not changed physically. The ceiling was the same height. The floor was the same composite material under my feet. The observation galleries were at the same level, but it felt completely different from a chair at the table, smaller in some ways, more real in others. The beings around me were not abstract political forces. They were individuals with specific mannerisms and particular ways of sitting, and the small physical habits that all living things develop over long periods of time. The Drell delegate Rel Kavesh, who now held the rotating chairmanship, had a way of resting both hands flat on the table's surface when he was thinking that reminded me, oddly, of Oliver Crane. 7 people from the human fleet who had been in the Expanse had not come home. 3 from the S. Hartwell, which had taken a direct power hit from the weapon system during the initial engagement before the signal was disrupted. 2 from the S. Calvert, in a collision during the high-density fleet operations that had nothing to do with the weapon and everything to do with the difficulty of coordinating 200 ships in a confined region of space at high tempo. 2 more from a medical emergency that Oliver Crane had worked 22 hours to prevent and could not. I knew all 7 names. I would know them for the rest of my life, not as a formal act of remembrance but as something that had simply embedded itself in me during the months since, the way certain things do, without announcement, without permission, becoming part of who you are and how you see what happened and what it cost and what it was worth. Sevketh was in the station. Not at the table, he was present as a formal witness before the Expanse Tribunal, which was meeting concurrently with the council session in the adjacent chamber. He had recovered in the way that you recover from something that takes 11 years out of your life, not completely, not cleanly, but steadily forward. Oliver Crane had continued providing medical support remotely for the months since the Persistence had docked at Kepler Station, and the 2 of them had developed a working friendship that surprised both of them and seemed to exist independently of any of the obvious differences between them. The reformed council structure differed from the old one in several meaningful ways. The Vethsari no longer held permanent chairmanship. It had passed, by vote, to a rotating body of 5 species, with the position changing every 3 years by election. The first chair under the new structure was Rel Kavesh of the Drell, which felt right in a way I had not anticipated when the vote was announced. Vailsur remained the Vethsari delegate, which had surprised some observers who expected her to step back after what had happened. She had not stepped back. She had remained, and she had navigated the aftermath of the Expanse disclosure with the skill of someone who had been doing this for 6 decades, getting ahead of the worst of it where she could, voting for the inquiry herself, accepting accountability without disappearing from the table. There was something in that I found myself respecting in a way I had not expected to. The first formal item of business at the Reformed Council's inaugural session was the Expanse Resolution. It was 412 pages. A team of 40 legal specialists from 12 species had drafted it, including 2 human international law experts who had worked without adequate breaks for 3 months and who both looked, when I saw them briefly before the session, like people who had gone very far inside a problem and were only now beginning to find the outside of it. The resolution contained full public disclosure of the Commission documents, the complete maintenance records, the casualty registry of every ship and crew member lost in the Expanse, the operational parameters of the weapon system, and a formal affirmation that the quarantine of humanity had been imposed on false grounds. It also contained an apology. The word apology had been debated for 6 weeks in the drafting process. Some species felt the term was insufficient. Others argued it was unnecessary from a legal standpoint. The final text used a phrase that Nina Cross had helped negotiate over 3 very long nights, a phrase in the common galactic tongue that translated as something between recognition of harm caused and commitment to a different path forward. I thought that was better than apology. Apology ends a thing. This committed to continuing. Relkavesh read the full resolution into the formal record. His voice was slow and even and carried to every corner of the chamber without amplification. I listened to every word. I had read the document many times in preparation, but hearing it read aloud in that room was different from reading it alone. The chamber gave it weight. The 215 witnesses around the table gave it context. When he finished, the vote was called. The Expanse resolution passed unanimously, including the Vethsari delegation. The second item was the Joint Expanse Survey, a coordinated, fully transparent exploration of the Expanse and the deep space surrounding it, conducted by a multi-species team, with all findings shared openly across the Council network. Mapping what was actually out there, understanding it, building a common picture of the region rather than maintaining a fence around it and hoping no one looked too closely. The vote was 209 in favor, 6 abstentions, 0 against. I noted the abstentions because abstentions in a vote like this are information. I would follow up with each of those delegations in the weeks ahead. That was the actual work, not the public votes, but the quiet conversations that shaped what happened before any vote was ever called. The survey was going to take years. The initial sensor data that the human fleet had collected showed something beneath the weapons system, and the wreck field that none of the Council's technical teams had been able to fully account for yet. A series of spatial anomalies, regions where the fabric of space itself had been altered in ways that no current galactic technology could produce. The alterations were ancient, hundreds of thousands of years old by the initial estimates, which placed them far before any of the species currently sitting at this table had existed in any recognizable form. Something had been in this region of space long before any of them, something capable of physically reshaping space itself. And the Vethsari, when their technical teams finally reviewed the full data openly, without the need to protect the program that had been built around the region, identified the anomalies as something their own ancient records had categorized, and then quietly buried in classification levels so deep that no one alive had known they existed. The Council had built a weapon to keep people out. The weapon was the lock. The anomalies were what the lock had been protecting. And the reason the lock had been maintained so long, without explanation, was that the beings who had placed it had eventually forgotten why, or had found it more comfortable not to look. The galaxy was older and stranger than the species governing it had been willing to say aloud. That was what the survey was going to begin to answer, and we were going to be part of it from the beginning, with a seat at the table and a fleet that had learned how to navigate a debris field in the dark. After the session formally closed, I was moving through the corridor toward the reception hall when Vailsur came to stand beside me. This had become, over the past 6 months, a quiet pattern between us. Not friendship, not exactly. Something more like mutual recognition. Two people who had been on opposite sides of something significant and had arrived, through different paths, at the same place. She stood beside me without speaking for a moment. The corridor was quiet in the way that large spaces become quiet after they have held many people. "You are as dangerous as we feared," she said. She said it in the common tongue, not through a relay. It was deliberate. I waited a moment. Then I replied, also in the common tongue, "Good. That means you will not make the mistake of underestimating us again." She almost smiled. It was very small, but I had spent a year learning to read Vethsori expressions, and I was confident about what I saw. She went into the reception. I stayed in the corridor for another moment. Pete appeared from somewhere behind me with 2 glasses of something that the catering staff had confirmed was compatible with human biology. He handed one to me. I took it. "How do you feel?" he asked. Pete did not ask this often. The fact that he asked meant he genuinely wanted to know. I thought about it carefully. 11 years of preparation. A vote that came back 211 to 3. A corridor outside that chamber where 214 species had laughed at us. The persistence running through a debris field at full speed in the dark. 17 wrecked ships drifting in forgotten orbits. Sevketh's hand on Nina's arm, one word before his eyes closed. Rao's voice, completely level, saying full speed as though it resolved everything, which it mostly had. 206 contact points on a scanner crossing a line that the most powerful governing body in the galaxy had drawn. 7 names I would carry the rest of my life. A guard at a door who had looked at a situation and quietly made a different decision. A chair at a table. The beginning of an honest conversation that should have happened a long time ago. "I feel like we are at the start," I said. Pete nodded once. "The survey is going to take years." "Yes. Whatever is in those anomalies is going to change what everyone thinks they know about this part of the galaxy. Probably in ways none of us can anticipate yet. And we are going to be in the middle of it from the beginning." "Yes," I said, "we are." He raised his glass. I raised mine. "To the animals," he said. "To the animals," I said. We went into the reception. The stars outside the station's observation windows were the same stars they had always been, ancient and patient and full of things that had not yet been named. But the window was bigger now, and we had a chair at the table, and a fleet that had learned what the expanse was hiding, and a survivor who had spent 11 years in the dark and come back because someone had gone in after him. The galaxy was going to have to adjust to our presence. I intended to make absolutely certain of it. That evening I sat in the small office that Earth's delegation had been assigned on Kepler Station. A real office, with a proper desk, with Earth's flag mounted on the wall alongside the Council emblem. And I opened my personal log for the first time in 3 months. I had not written in it since the day of the original vote. There had not been time, or rather, everything had been moving too fast and too close to translate into words. You cannot write about a river when you are inside the current. Now I was on the bank. Now I could see the shape of it. I wrote for a long time. I wrote about what it had felt like to stand at that podium and hear the number 211 and understand what it meant. I wrote about the word Veilsur had used and the silence that had preceded it and the laughter that followed. I wrote about Pete's grandmother and her saying about the ocean. I wrote about Grace Fuller sitting still at her console after Rec 17 and speaking very quietly into the silence of the bridge. I wrote about Oliver Crane working without stopping, refusing the outcome that the biology suggested was likely. I wrote about Sevketh, 11 years in a pod in the dark, who had sealed himself in and waited rather than stopped waiting. I wrote about the 7 names. Then I wrote about the part that I kept returning to. They called us animals. I wrote that sentence and sat with it for a while. They were not entirely wrong. We are the descendants of hunters. We carry that in the way our eyes work and the way our neurons process threat and the way our hands tighten on things when we are not sure what is coming next. That does not disappear with civilization. 10,000 years of building culture and language and philosophy over the top of something older does not remove the something older. It builds on it. It works with it. Sometimes it works against it with varying results. But here is what the council could not see, because they were looking at our history of conflict and finding the sharp edges and calling that the complete picture. We are also the species that looked at a dark sky full of things that could end us and decided, generation after generation, to go outside anyway. We crossed oceans we could not see across in boats that should not have survived the crossing. We climbed mountains that had no practical reason to be climbed. We sent machines out of our atmosphere on the principle that there was something out there worth knowing about. We built languages for talking to beings we had never met. We prepared, for decades, for a conversation with a civilization that we were not certain existed. Not because we were unafraid. We were often very afraid, because we were afraid and we went anyway. Because something in our nature, the same deep nature that made the council classify us as dangerous, cannot stop asking what is on the other side of the thing we cannot yet see. They built a fence. We asked what it was hiding. The answer changed everything, and we are only at the very beginning of understanding what it means. The survey teams will go into the expanse with proper equipment and full cooperation, and the time needed to do the work carefully. They will map the anomalies. They will try to understand what made them, and when and why something capable of reshaping space chose this particular region to do it. They will find things that none of us can currently predict, and those things will raise more questions than they resolve, and we will follow those questions the way we have always followed questions. Into the dark, one careful step at a time, with as many people beside us as we can manage to bring along. We have a seat at the table, a real one with our name on it, and the species around that table are going to have to learn what it means to share a space with a species that cannot stop looking. I think it is going to be good for all of them. I think it is going to be the most remarkable chapter in the long history of this species, not because we won something, or proved something, or overcame someone, but because we walked into a room where we were not wanted, asked the questions that needed asking, and the questions turned out to matter to everyone in the room whether they wanted them to or not. That is what we are when we are at our best, not just hunters, not just survivors, not just beings with ambition and sharp edges. We are the species that goes to find out. And there is so much left to find. Captain Alara Voss, Earth Senior Delegate, Galactic Council. Kepler Station, year one of a longer story than anyone expected.